Jack Turner thought he'd finally found peace. After years of construction work in the city, breathing in dust and diesel, surrounded by the constant hammer of jackhammers and the screaming of traffic, he bought 5 acres of land outside a small town where trees still outnumbered people, and the sky opened up so wide it made him feel like he could finally breathe again. Every morning, sunlight spilled across the fields in gold, and Jack heard something he hadn't heard in years. Silence. Real silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of wind through leaves, birds calling to each other, the soft rustle of tall grass bending in the breeze. No neighbors shouting through thin walls. No sirens at 3 in the morning, just the land, the air, and the kind of quiet that let a man think his own thoughts. He built himself a farmhouse, 1 room at a time, just like he'd always dreamed. His wife Emma loved it just as much, though her work as director of the State Construction and Structural Compliance Bureau kept her traveling more than either of them liked. Still, this was their plan, to live calm, simple, private lives away from the chaos they'd spent decades navigating. Jack had no idea his peaceful new town came with the most aggressive homeowners association in the state, and that they would soon come after him like he was a fugitive from their manufactured law. The barn was Jack's masterpiece. He built it himself over 3 months, a stunning wooden structure with stone pillars and a pitched roof that looked like something out of an architectural magazine. He followed every code, obtained every permit, double-checked every measurement against state regulations. When he finished, the barn became the pride of his land. Big sliding doors that moved smooth as water, reinforced beams that could hold twice the weight they'd ever need to bear, craftsmanship that made him proud every time he looked at it. He never expected anyone would hate it. But Martha Graff, the HOA president, stood on the neighborhood boundary with binoculars, staring at Jack's barn like it was a threat to everything she held sacred. She didn't like people doing things without her permission, even when she had absolutely no authority over them at all. For Martha, the town was her kingdom, and anyone who didn't bow was a problem that needed solving. On a sunny morning, when Jack was planning to start work on a new chicken coop, he found a white envelope taped to his gate. The bold letters across the front declared it an HOA legal notice of violation. Jack raised an eyebrow. He wasn't part of the HOA. His land wasn't inside their development. He'd checked the property lines 3 times before he bought the place. But the letter accused him of visual disruption, architectural inconsistency, and community value reduction. Most importantly, it demanded he remove the barn within 14 days or face fines. Jack chuckled, thinking it was some kind of joke, maybe a prank from old work buddies who knew he'd moved out here. Then he noticed the small print at the bottom, signed by Martha Graff, HOA president. He shook his head, went inside, and dropped the letter in the trash. Simple. At least, he thought so. 2 days later, Jack was sanding a new door frame when he heard voices. He looked up and saw 3 people walking across his field with clipboards like they owned the place. HOA board members, no permission, no warning. Jack walked out calmly, wiping sawdust from his hands. He asked if he could help them. Martha smiled like a queen addressing a servant, and informed him they were there to inspect his illegal structure. Jack blinked. He explained that the barn sat on private land outside HOA jurisdiction and was fully permitted. Martha leaned in, her voice dripping with condescension, and informed him that everything in the area fell under community aesthetic law. Jack stared at her, then said quietly that he didn't think so. Her smile faded. And that's when he realized she wasn't used to hearing the word no, and people who aren't used to that word tend to react badly when they finally hear it.
Jack's refusal didn't just surprise Martha, it enraged her. She took a step forward, jabbing a finger toward his chest, her voice rising as she declared that no one built anything around here without board approval, and if he didn't cooperate, they'd remove the structure themselves. Jack calmly wiped his hands on a rag and told her to try it. The board members looked at each other, genuinely shocked that someone dared talk back to their president. Martha leaned in close and whispered, as if delivering a prophecy, that he had no idea who he was dealing with. Jack grinned. Neither did she. Later that evening, Jack sat on the porch polishing a handmade table when he heard a car roll up the driveway. Emma stepped out, clean suit, hair pulled back, briefcase in hand. She just returned from the state capitol. Jack handed her the HOA violation letter like showing her a bad joke. She read it calmly, then smirked, asking if they really told him to tear down his own barn. He confirmed they had. Emma sighed, then gave a quiet laugh, saying they'd picked the wrong property. Because Emma wasn't just a government employee. She was the director of the State Construction and Structural Compliance Bureau, the highest authority in the entire building regulation system for the state, and the HOA had no idea whose barn they were threatening to bulldoze. Jack was tightening the final support beam the next week when the rumble of multiple engines drifted across the open acreage. He stepped into the doorway just in time to see 3 dark SUVs roll in, tires grinding over gravel like they were arriving for a raid. Doors opened in formation, and out stepped Martha, wearing oversized sunglasses and the kind of smug expression usually reserved for rulers about to sign someone's exile. Behind her, 2 board members followed with tablets and clipboards. A videographer started filming, clearly expecting to capture the triumphant moment the barn was shut down. Martha planted herself in front of Jack and declared loudly enough for the camera that his illegal structure violated multiple sections of their visual harmony charter and that demolition orders would begin immediately. She looked like she expected Jack to panic or beg. He didn't. Instead, he leaned back against a beam, arms folded, and smirked. Because in the distance, another vehicle was already approaching, and Martha had no idea that the real authority was about to arrive. The HOA members turned as a white State Construction Bureau truck pulled to a stop beside them. The door opened, and stepping out was Emma, though no one would have recognized the cheerful spouse who packed lunches and tended the garden. Today she was in uniform, hair neatly tied back, badge displayed, clipboard under one arm. Authority radiated from her with every step. Martha was halfway through dictating another violation when Emma cut into the scene by flipping open her credentials with crisp precision, introducing herself as State Construction Bureau Director Cole and informing them that this site was under state jurisdiction and they needed to step away from the active work area immediately. Martha's words evaporated. For the first time all day, the HOA board looked nervous. One even lowered his camera. Martha stammered, trying to gather her aggression, insisting they were enforcing HOA rules. Emma didn't blink. She explained that the HOA did not have jurisdiction here, that this was agricultural development land recognized by the state, and that they were currently trespassing on a protected construction zone. The board visibly crumbled. Martha's jaw tightened because Emma had just pulled the entire rug out of under their offensive.
Emma began a steady, professional walk-around inspection of the barn, photographing the foundation, the framing, the permits attached to the wall, even the surrounding fence line. Martha tried to rebuild her confidence and announced to the camera crew that they were filing an injunction to stop all further construction. Emma calmly reappeared from behind a support beam and explained that they couldn't, that the build was fully permitted under agricultural development statute and registered with the state, and that any delays they attempted to impose would count as administrative interference. One board member actually went pale. Another cleared his throat and whispered to Martha that they weren't told any of this. Emma then delivered the final blow, explaining that every one of these permits was filed long before they escalated anything, and the only procedural violations happening today were theirs. Jack stayed quiet, watching the energy shift. This wasn't just an inspection. It was a legal ambush, and they'd walked right into it. Emma returned to her truck and pulled out a large brown file, thick enough to slam shut a courtroom. She opened it and began reading calmly, listing violation after violation that the HOA itself had committed. Unauthorized retaining walls built at the community lakeshore, outbuildings constructed without environmental review, paving conducted without proper soil permits, board signatures missing from required approvals. Martha's cheeks flushed red. The board members looked like schoolchildren hearing their wrongdoings read over the PA system. Emma didn't raise her voice. Her calmness made each violation hit harder. She explained that these projects were filed under HOA discretionary budget and executed without proper authorization, and if their organization continued to interfere here, they might have to discuss suspension of their administrative status until these were resolved. Martha swallowed. The videographer pretended to film a tree instead of her face. Jack finally spoke, low and measured, noting that they came here to tear down his barn, but it turned out they'd brought demolition paperwork for their own organization. One board member quietly turned and walked back to the SUV like he suddenly remembered an urgent appointment elsewhere. Cornered, embarrassed, and visibly unraveling, Martha resorted to her most desperate weapon, personal intimidation. She marched right up to Jack until she was close enough to hiss so only he could hear, insisting this wasn't over, that she would find something, another violation, another technicality, because she always did. Jack didn't flinch. He just leaned in slightly and whispered that he hoped she brought extra ink because she'd be filling out a lot more complaint forms before this was done. Martha stepped back, eyes flaming, but before she could respond, a sheriff's cruiser rolled in. Sheriff Mills stepped out, hand resting on his belt, sunglasses reflecting the HOA convoy. He'd already spoken to Emma. He already knew what was happening. Martha's face fell. She wasn't just fighting one man anymore. She was standing against the state, the sheriff, and her own exposed violations, and for the first time since she arrived, she looked like she realized she might actually lose. Sheriff Mills walked toward the standoff with the slow, deliberate posture of someone who had been through far worse disputes than HOA territory wars. Gravel crunched under his boots as he stopped between Jack and Martha, giving one look at the camera crew, another at the visibly rattled board members. He greeted Jack with a nod, then turned to Martha and explained that he'd received complaints from both sides and was here to determine who was actually breaking the law today. Martha perked up immediately, recovering some of her false confidence, flashing what she thought was her winning smile. She started explaining that Jack was constructing without HOA clearance, but Mills raised a hand sharply, cutting her off. He informed her that he'd already spoken to the State Construction Bureau. Martha blinked. That wasn't the answer she expected. Mills continued, tone unchanging, explaining that Jack's construction was fully permitted, fully compliant, and fully legal, which meant anyone trying to forcibly interfere with it was trespassing and obstructing development. He paused, letting silence sharpen the air.
One HOA member audibly gulped. Martha forced a laugh, the brittle kind someone makes before a panic attack, insisting they were the governing board and had jurisdiction. Mills pushed his sunglasses up and told her no. They had rules, but Jack had state law. He then gestured toward their SUVs and ordered them to leave the property immediately. The videographer lowered the camera. Martha's voice cracked as she asked if he was serious. Mills leaned in slightly and told her he was so serious that if they didn't leave, he'd start handing out citations, starting with her. Martha swallowed, chest rising and falling rapidly, suddenly realizing she had shown up today expecting to seize the upper hand, but instead was being told to leave like an unruly guest at someone else's barbecue. Martha was furious, a boiling red-faced silence broken only by the sound of her heels clicking too hard as she shoved her sunglasses back onto her nose. She signaled for the board to follow her back to the SUVs, and they hurried after her like frightened interns who didn't want to be the last target of her anger. But despite the public humiliation, she wasn't finished. She paused at her SUV door, leaned down, and looked at Jack with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, asking if he thought one little victory meant he'd won. Her voice was soft now, too soft, the voice of someone who had shifted from open attack to covert planning. She explained that the board filed hundreds of pages of disputes every year and knew how to wear people down, suggesting he enjoy his barn while it was still standing. She stepped into the SUV, shutting the door harder than necessary. The convoy pulled away, dust rising behind them, but Jack could feel the message in his bones. Martha wasn't backing off. She was switching weapons, and that was always more dangerous.
Jack and Emma walked back toward the barn together, but the adrenaline hadn't settled. There was relief, certainly, but also something else that came from experience. They both knew this wasn't the end. Emma spoke first, explaining that Martha wouldn't act again in the open, but would start filing letters, complaints, disputes, zoning challenges, every administrative trick she had. Jack nodded, rubbing a hand along the fresh wooden beam, saying that's what he was counting on. Emma stopped walking and observed that he was planning something. Jack smiled, not mischievously, but with the calm of someone prepared. He explained that Martha thought she was the only one who could weaponize paperwork, but she forgot he'd spent 10 years in engineering and everything he built had a defense plan. He then pulled out a folder Emma hadn't seen, a backup set of documents he'd been preparing for weeks: border surveys, historic land records, agricultural registry exemptions, state protections, HOA overreach cases, signed affidavits from prior landowners. Emma flipped through them, eyebrows rising, realizing he was ready before this even started. Jack looked up at the barn frame and said no one starts a fight with an HOA without planning the second, third, and fourth battle ahead. Together they locked the barn for the evening, not afraid, but tightening their armor. Martha was going legal, and so were they. That night, the HOA clubhouse, usually polished and filled with pastel decor, looked more like a war room. Martha sat at the head of the conference table, arms crossed, tapping one perfectly manicured nail against a stack of documents. The other board members looked uneasy, eyes darting, feet shuffling, energy tense. One finally spoke, pointing out that they were almost arrested today. Martha didn't blink, saying the sheriff wouldn't be a problem once the county administrator saw their formal complaints. Another member pushed his tablet across the table, noting that they were the ones with violated permits right now, and if the state took this further, they could face serious consequences. Martha slammed her palm on the table and declared they would not retreat. Silence fell. Then she leaned back, more controlled now, a strategist again. She said they would bury him in paperwork, zoning reviews, sound ordinance challenges, environmental approvals, traffic access limitations, filing until his wife got reassigned or until they cracked. One whispered, asking, "What if they didn't crack?" Martha smiled a slow, icy smile and said everything cracked eventually. The board looked shaken because Martha wasn't promising a fair win, she was promising a siege, and Jack didn't even know yet how many battles she was about to ignite.
The first letter arrived at 6:30 in the morning, slid under Jack's door by a courier who didn't even bother knocking. Jack picked it up, still half awake, and immediately recognized the overly formal HOA stationery with its gold crest and unnecessary embossing. He opened it to find a demand for noise mitigation review, stating construction must halt pending compliance. Emma walked in holding coffee and asked if it was another one. Jack held up the envelope and said, "No, the first." She gave a low exhale, not surprise, but confirmation. This wasn't going to be a single attack. It was going to be a campaign. By noon, 3 more letters arrived: Environmental Impact Challenge, Traffic Safety Review Request, and Public Access Pathway Obstruction Complaint. Emma reviewed each document calmly, then placed them in separate labeled folders, like a lawyer preparing for trial. She explained these were boilerplate filings designed to overwhelm them into pausing construction. Jack smirked and said then they'd build faster. But he knew what Martha was doing. She wasn't breaking rules, she was weaponizing them. A far more dangerous strategy. By the weekend, the HOA wasn't just filing paperwork, they were rewriting the narrative. HOA newsletters started arriving in mailboxes with headlines warning of unsafe barn construction with no community input, and suggesting the sheriff was protecting outsider property owners over resident safety. Martha stood on porches handing out flyers, her voice full of carefully manufactured concern, insisting they didn't want conflict, but just safe, orderly development. Parents nodded, retired couples frowned. Rumors spread like wildfire. Jack was planning to run an illegal farm. The barn would lower property values. Emma was abusing her position. The sheriff was being influenced. Worst of all, many people believed it. That night, Jack drove through the neighborhood and saw families whispering on sidewalks, pointing at him like he was a threat instead of a neighbor. Martha had realized something powerful. If the system didn't stop Jack, social pressure might. Jack didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't fire back online. He made one phone call to Sheriff Mills. They met the next morning in the sheriff's truck overlooking the lake. Mills handed Jack a thick binder, explaining it contained public record requests, showing every complaint the HOA filed was documented and had a response deadline. Jack flipped through pages and saw the perfect opportunity, noting that these filings came in too fast, and some of these reviews took 30 business days minimum, meaning filing them all at once constituted administrative abuse. Mills nodded in agreement. Jack already had a plan forming, something precise. If Martha wanted to fight by the book, he would weaponize the book harder than she ever imagined. Emma joined them with another folder, thinner but more powerful. Historical land documents showing that Jack's property had special agricultural exemptions dating back 80 years, meaning many of the HOA filings didn't legally apply at all. Jack stared at the sunrise over his barn framework and breathed that it was time to go from defense to offense.
Paper attacks weren't stopping construction, and Martha knew it, so she escalated. The HOA sent what they called a safety inspection team. 3 board members in reflective vests they clearly bought that morning, arriving unannounced and trying to walk onto Jack's property with clipboards, rulers, and cameras. Jack intercepted them at the gate and pointed out they weren't licensed inspectors. One of them cleared his throat sheepishly and claimed they were empowered by the community charter. Jack cut him off, saying no, they were empowered by Martha's panic. They tried to push past him. Jack stepped in front of them, posture relaxed but unmovable, a man who had dealt with stubborn machinery, stubborn bosses, and small-minded authority before. He told them quietly that if they took one step onto this land, the sheriff would charge them with trespassing. A truck engine rumbled behind them. Sheriff Mills stepped out and casually announced that their inspection forms didn't exist in state code. One of the men's clipboards literally drooped in his hands. Martha's new tactic had failed, and she wasn't even there to watch it burn. 3 days later, early morning sunlight washed over the barn frame as Jack and his construction team secured beams in place. Sawdust floated through the air like glitter when Emma jogged toward Jack holding her phone, telling him he needed to see something. A new email had landed. State Development Oversight Notice. Investigation initiated into HOA complaint activity. Jack blinked. Emma read the summary aloud, explaining that the state was auditing the HOA for misuse of administrative filings in an attempt to halt permitted development. Sheriff Mills drove up moments later, stepping out with a grin, saying he told them the state didn't like paperwork bullies. For the first time, Martha wasn't holding the attack position. She was under investigation. The battlefield had shifted. The HOA was no longer the predator. They were now the target. Jack didn't celebrate, not yet, because he knew that cornering someone like Martha didn't end the fight. It forced them to get desperate, and the next move would be her most aggressive yet. The investigation rattled the HOA like a bomb going off in the middle of a church meeting. Members rushed into an emergency board session at Martha's house. Voices rose through open windows, some fearful, some angry, most blaming Martha. But Martha refused to fold. She shouted that they were not losing control of this community, pounding the table for emphasis. If the state wouldn't stop Jack, then they'd force a shutdown. Someone tried to reason with her, warning that if the state found out they pressured false filings, there would be serious consequences. Martha snapped that they wouldn't find out. Her eyes burned with the fury of a woman who had spent years controlling a neighborhood like her personal kingdom and now watched someone walk in and redraw the borders. She pointed to a printed aerial map of Jack's property and announced they would shut down the access road. Someone gasped, saying that was illegal. Martha leaned in, voice like steel, and said only if they got caught. She wasn't playing politics anymore.
She was planning sabotage. The next morning, Jack drove toward the barn with lumber in the back of his truck, only to stop dead in the road. A row of massive concrete planters, the kind you'd see outside a bank or government building, blocked his driveway entrance. Each had a fresh HOA sticker on the front. A bright red sign read, "Emergency Safety Barrier, No Access." Jack stepped out, jaw tight, eyes narrowing. Here it was, Martha's desperate, illegal final swing.
Around the bend came Martha herself, arms folded, smirk locked in place. She announced sweetly that the access road was closed for hazard review, and nothing entered or left until they finished their findings. Jack didn't yell. He didn't even speak. He simply took out his phone and dialed Sheriff Mills. Martha's smile faltered. For the first time, it wasn't Jack who looked nervous. It was her. 28 minutes later, the sound of tires crunching gravel filled the air. Sheriff Mills stepped out of his cruiser, but he wasn't alone. A second car parked behind him. A woman in a dark slate blazer stepped out, holding a slim leather briefcase. State Construction Oversight Agent Denise Harper. Martha blinked. This wasn't supposed to happen. Harper tapped one of the concrete barriers and explained that this obstruction was placed without a traffic permit, civil authorization, or emergency declaration. Martha tried to speak, stammering that they had authority under their charter. Harper cut her off with surgical calm, saying, "No, they had rules, but Jack had state law." Then she handed Martha a document, a full-page cease and desist order signed by the state attorney general. Martha's face drained of color. Harper continued, explaining that these barriers must be removed immediately, and the HOA was now officially under state investigation. Jack watched silently as HOA board members quietly began pushing the planters aside, humiliated and furious. This wasn't just a reversal, this was a collapse. The HOA had crossed a line, and Martha had taken them over the edge. That night, the HOA clubhouse overflowed with angry homeowners. Board members sat red-faced in plastic chairs, avoiding eye contact. Martha arrived last. No clipboard, no smug expression, just a hollow stare. The room erupted with voices shouting that she'd cost them thousands, that they'd trusted her, that she'd lied to all of them. Martha tried to regain her footing, insisting she was protecting their community, but the room shouted her down. Then someone moved to the center of the floor, a quiet board member named Donald Rowan, who had witnessed everything from the beginning. He motioned to remove Martha as president of the HOA immediately. The room went silent. A vote was called. Hands shot into the air one after another, leading to a landslide. Martha looked around stunned. Her power, her reputation, her empire was gone in a single vote. She walked out with shaking hands, and for the first time in months, Jack's road to the barn was clear in every meaning of the word. 2 weeks later, morning sunlight cut across the newly finished barn. Fresh timber glowed warmly, windows reflected the lake, and a hand-carved sign hung over the door reading, "Turner Family Barn." Jack, Emma, Sheriff Mills, and dozens of neighbors, many who had finally realized the truth, gathered for the opening. Kids ran inside, amazed at the polished stalls, tools, and perfectly organized workshop. Emma gave Jack a smile that said more than words could, telling him he fought with honor. Jack looked out at the quiet lake, the rolling hills, the community finally at peace. He said softly that this isn't just a barn, it's a reminder that no one owns a town with fear. Sheriff Mills clapped him on the shoulder and said with a grin that if they tried again, they knew who would win. From across the street, a moving truck was loading the last boxes into Martha's car. She stared once. No anger, no threats, just the hollow realization that the world she ruled no longer belonged to her. Jack didn't gloat. He'd already won. The barn stood tall, the land was legally protected, and the town finally understood something Martha never could. Real power isn't control. It's respect earned through standing firm when others try to break you down, through knowing the law better than those who wield it as a weapon, and through building something beautiful that no amount of fear or manipulation can ever truly destroy.